principles of ethics that you don't need an ethicist to help us with is transparency. Something that is okay to be on the front page of the paper that supports your institution least is probably okay. And something that you don't want revealed is not okay. Science cannot work in secrecy. But a decision was made here that secrecy was needed because people wouldn't understand the subtleties of this and the importance of it. And in fact, I would tell you that if there's one thing to see, it's a Nova documentary in 1993 on the Tuskegee study called The Deadly Deception. And there is an interview that is chilling with John Cutler, an old man at this time, who was punished for this work by becoming dean of the School of Public Health at Pittsburgh. But an older man, looking back when he was 36, but now old, who said, he was said to be violently opposed to ending the Tuskegee study and giving these people antibiotics. And he said, of course I was violently opposed. The study was so important. It should not be stopped. It was too important. And if you ever want a statement more clear that ends justify the means, I think John Cutler's is probably the poster child for that point of view. So, yes, sir.
You said that ending the study, but then giving antibiotics?
No, not giving. He wanted to continue the study and withhold antibiotics because he was learning so much about what syphilis was doing to the body.
So one thing that happened as part of this study was, as Steve said, they knew what the effect of syphilis was on treatment. And intentionally, the researchers withheld the medication in order to see what the progress of the disease was. And they used it as an opportunity to take pictures and create documentation about how the disease progresses, how it progresses in different individuals, at what point you have to intervene before the toxicity is too severe, and to have medical documentation to help instruct medical school students, textbooks, etc., about the progression of the disease. So it was not just the prophylaxis that they were studying, but also the progression of the disease and what it would look like over time. So that was both in the Tuskegee study, but also in this study as well. And I mean, just building on your question about, was it known? That's there's no record of any subject giving consent. They knew in the Tara Oates study that they had to give consent, and the same group of researchers had explicit conversations about the importance of informed consent. There were contemporary articles that were written at the time about the importance of informed consent in research trials, and there were the Nuremberg trials, which laid down the principles of informed consent. So all of this was against a background and a time when informed consent was really part of the dialogue. People understood what that concept meant at the time.
Okay. The numbers are large. You can read these here. These are the big ones. Over 1,300 people, we believe, intentionally exposed. The ethical analysis, I think we can. Nita, would you like to summarize this?
Sure. So we actually first were planning on simply issuing the historical report as just a historical analysis, and we felt like we actually couldn't do so without commenting on the historical an ethical analysis of what happened. And one thing that's very difficult about doing an ethical analysis of a historical practice is not simply imposing today's standards of ethics on a past practice, but instead trying to contextualize and understand what happened. So what we did was we looked at both what the contemporary understanding of ethics was at the time and tried to assess the practices that happened according to those contemporary standards, and then to look at today's standards and say, are there differences in today's standards and how we would actually approach that? The later study, which we'll talk about, focuses much more on the contemporary standards, but we strongly condemned the practices of the research, both by the standards at the time as well as today's standards. And there were a couple of things that really stood out. One is the faulty scientific design of the studies. So even if you have any belief in ends justify the means of scientific research, which the Commission did not share that perspective, this was not one in which even the ends could come anywhere close to justifying the means, because there was no research of scientific merit that actually occurred in these studies. And that's because they were done in such haphazard ways. So rather than following a patterned inquiry where you go step by step and build on the results of initial studies to inform later studies and try to have controls and experiments, it was as if whatever they could get done, they tried to get done. And they did it in no particular order, so it wasn't carefully designed. The types of transmission that were used, they actually had specific warnings against using them the way that they did. The data actually ended up being altered along the way. The subjects who were infected with STDs weren't ultimately treated. Some of them were treated, some of them weren't treated. And no scientific publication ever followed. It was never reported in a single scientific publication because there was no study that could be reported that had any scientific merit. And that's incredibly egregious in and of itself, right? To do scientific experimentation on human research subjects when you do it in a haphazard way with no scientific merit, there's already a significant burden that you need to overcome to do research on human research subjects. To do so in this kind of manner was, in our minds, totally inappropriate and at odds with how scientific research was conducted at the time and today. Second, and most importantly, was the failure to obtain consent. Right? Subjects were lied to. And this is, under today's standard, we actually really focus on the type of populations that are studied. We care about, are these captive populations, like prison populations, require really additional scrutiny and attention because they're captive, they are more likely to be vulnerable, they're less likely to be able to give their full and autonomous consent. And this was we went into another country, worked with another country's government, did things we could not do in this country and the researchers recognized would be at odds with the ethical standards of this country. Did so on a separate population in another country without obtaining their consent and, in fact, by deceiving them and lying to them. And under the standards of the time, when informed consent was something that we understood well and believed to be an important principle of scientific research, as well as the standards today, which really emphasize this point as well, we think this is a kind of practice that is easily condemned, and the individuals who were involved are blameworthy individuals for what they did, including the people who endorsed it at the higher levels. And on that point, Steve said this earlier, which is, you might think that Terra Haute is better because there was informed consent. But we also might think that there are certain types of research that simply should not happen. There are certain types of things that you simply should not be able to do to other human beings. And there's a real question about whether intentionally infecting individuals with sexually transmitted diseases, even if they fully consented to it, is something that we as a society would support or endorse or permit and allow federal funding to fund and support. And we didn't really go into that as much in this report, except to recognize that even if there had been informed consent, it may not have been adequate by contemporary standards of human research protection.
I would say that I was opposed to having faulty scientific design at the top of the reasons why this was bad, because I think it's irrelevant. It's important, but it is not relevant to the problem. Some of the work that the Nazis did was medically, biologically correct. We do not use that information. So even the concept that, well, if this was good science, maybe it would be less objectionable. Had they done the controls properly? I think we don't want to even, or I wouldn't want to even imply that that was a consideration in how we judge this. And this is a slippery slope. In some respects, this is an easy one. But those of you who are looking for holiday gifts, I might recommend a book called Polio by David Ashinsky, who's a great historical scholar who described the polio epidemic. And again, some of us lived through this as kids. And in the polio epidemic, the live vaccine was tested in populations not very different from here. Meant schools for the retarded, Jewish school for the retarded, other schools, clearly without their consent. So, and that was in the late 50s, early 60s. So, and the people who did that we think of as great figures.
So, Steve, I want to, and you'll see we have these dialogues within the commission. I think it was important to include faulty scientific design. And the reason I think it's important is because as an ethical analysis about whether or not it's justified to do research on human research subjects, I think a faulty scientific design tells us that it is not justified to research at all on human subjects when you don't actually have a sound scientific approach to do so.
Yeah.
And so I think from that perspective, it makes sense to include. I agree with you. There's no implication that the ends justify the means, but I see that we're quickly coming to time, and I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions. So, Mildred, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to follow up on that point, because I agree with you that the presence of a good scientific design is maybe necessary but not sufficient. That doesn't necessarily say it's also ethical.
That's
but
right.
The lack of a scientific design is a completely different thing.
Right.
And so I'm just wondering if you thought or had discussed anything about sort of the, what I'm always curious about with this in the Tuskegee is how does someone do a project that is so long, spends so much effort, spends all these resources, never publishes on it, and they still get money to do it? To me, it says that there's something also maybe that maybe should be part of an ethical analysis in the process of peer review of science.
Yeah.
How is it